Hi everyone! In this video, I'm going to be going over your week 6 social studies assignment, which will be one worksheet that you're filling out, but this worksheet has questions from 4 different readings, which are titled here in bold. So you have the Life in Ancient Rome reading, you have the Roman Army reading, Gladiators, and Important People of Rome. I'm going to be going over the questions and all the passages in this one video, so then that way you only have to go to one place. I am going to try and once I make this video, add timestamps in the description box, so that way if you worked on the Life in Ancient Rome, but you're pausing and the next day you're going to work on a different part, I want you to be able to quickly jump to the section that you need. I'm new to YouTube, so I'm still working that out. So hopefully I'll be able to figure out how to do timestamps. If not, I'll at least list what time each section starts below in the description box. So look out for that if you know that you're not somebody who's going to sit here and do this whole assignment in one go. But I will be breaking it up by reading. So for example, I'm going to read the questions to the Life in Ancient Rome passage first. Then I'll read the passage, then I'll skip down to the Roman army and so on and so forth. And again, I am going to try and have timestamps in the description box so you can jump around easily as you need to. So first, the Life in Ancient Rome questions. You have 3 of them for this reading. Number 1 asks you to describe the purpose of the forum. Number 2 asks, what was the purpose of the bread and circuses? And specifically, why did the government have them? And number 3 is a true or false question. And it gives you a statement, poor people went to school. And you need to determine and circle whether or not that's true or false. So those are the things to keep in mind as we're reading. And now I'm going to read the Life in Rome passage. So it says, daily life in Rome. The rich and poor had very different lives in the Roman Empire, as did men and women. The city of Rome was laid out in a square with the forum in the middle. The forum was an open space that served as a marketplace and public square. Temples and buildings sat around it. So if you can see, Mrs. Solano's highlighted information here, and there's information about the forum here. So this is where you want to look to help you with the answer to number 1. Rich Romans lived in large houses. Each home had big rooms, fine furniture, and gardens. In the center of each house was an inner court called an atrium. Rich Romans also had homes called villas on their country estates. Most people in Rome were poor. They lived in apartment buildings made of stone and wood. Rents were high. Whole families lived in one room. Roman apartment buildings could be 6 stories high. They were not well built. The people who lived in them used torches and lamps, so there were a lot of fires. This part of Rome was crowded and dirty. People threw trash into the streets. There were many thieves. The Roman government did some things to keep people from rioting. The government gave the poor bread and circuses. This means that the poor got some free food and shows. Some of the shows were chariot races and gladiator contests. Gladiators fought animals and each other. Most gladiators were enslaved people, criminals, or poor people. So here, there's highlighted information that you want to use to help you with the answer to number 2 about bread and circuses. What was family life like? Roman families included parents, young children, married children, their families, other relatives, and enslaved servants. The father was called the paterfamilias. That means father of the family. He controlled the other family members. Rich Romans hired tutors to teach their children. Some older boys from rich families went away to learn reading, writing, and rhetoric. Rhetoric means public speaking. Girls studied reading and writing at home. They also learned household duties. Poor people did not go to school. Romans boys became of age when they were between 14 and 16. To celebrate, they burned their toys. This showed that they were no longer boys. They could become soldiers or join the government. Many became partners in family businesses. Men wore togas, which are loose robes. Roman women did not become adults until they married. Women wore long flowing robes with cloaks. The cloaks were called palla. Women in early Rome had some rights but were not full citizens. They could not vote. Rich women had a lot of freedom. They could own land, run businesses, and sell property. They could go to the theater or coliseum. Enslaved people did the housework. This gave rich women time to study literature, art, and fashion. Women with less money worked in their homes or in family businesses. They were allowed to leave home to shop, visit friends, worship at temples, or to go to the baths. Some women did work independently outside the home. Some were priestesses. Others were hairdressers or doctors. How did the Romans treat enslaved people? Slavery was always a part of the Roman Empire, but as the empire grew, more and more people were enslaved. By 100 BC, about 40% of the people in Italy were enslaved. Enslaved people worked in homes, fields, mines, and workshops. They helped build roads, bridges, and aqueducts. Many enslaved Greeks were well educated. They were teachers, doctors, and artisans. For most enslaved people, life was hard. They often rebelled. In 73 BC, a gladiator named Spartacus led 70,000 enslaved people against Rome. They beat several Roman armies. Rome finally conquered them 2 years later. Spartacus and 6,000 others were killed. Roman religion. The ancient Romans worshipped many gods and goddesses. They believed that spirits lived in things like trees and rivers. Roman emperors called themselves gods too. The Romans adopted Greek gods and goddesses. They gave them Roman names. For example, the Greek sky god Zeus became the Roman god Jupiter. Romans offered food and prayer to their gods and goddesses. The important gods and goddesses of Rome were honored in the temples. In addition, every Roman home had an altar for household gods. Some Roman priests looked for messages from the gods. They studied the insides of dead animals and watched the way the birds flew. The Romans also borrowed the Greek philosophy of Stoicism. For Greeks, Stoicism was about finding happiness through reason. For Romans, however, Stoicism meant living in a particular way. Stoic philosophers urged people to do their civic duty and to treat conquered peoples well. When the Romans conquered other people, they let them keep their religion as long as the religion did not threaten the empire. So again, that was the Daily Life in Rome reading that goes with these first 3 questions here. And Ms. Solano does have important information highlighted, as well as the information you need for these answers highlighted. So now I'll go over the questions for the Roman army reading, which number 4 asks, what are legions? Number 5, what is a centurion? And number 6, what are siege tactics? And she also asks you to give one example. So about the Roman army, a world-class fighting force. Many people consider the ancient Roman army the most successful fighting force in history. They were highly trained, strictly disciplined, and well-equipped. Men were trained to be fighting machines who were willing to stand and fight even when the odds were against them. Soldiers had to march, run, and swim in their heavy armor. Soldiers practiced using their short swords, shields, and heavy javelins. Roman soldiers were rewarded for bravery and severely punished for cowardice or disobedience. Army organization. The main part of the army consisted of infantry units called legions. One legion was made up of about 5,000 foot soldiers. For training and fighting, each legion was divided into smaller units called centuries and cohorts. A century was made up of 80 soldiers under the command of an officer called a centurion. 6 centuries made up a unit called a cohort. Besides the regular army, there were the auxiliary forces such as cavalry, archers, or slingshot throwers. Auxiliaries were recruited from the provinces for their special skills. After 25 years of service, auxiliary soldiers could become Roman citizens. Joining the professional army was a way out of poverty since soldiers were paid salaries and received free room and board. When soldiers retired, they were given money or a small plot of farmland. Fighting tactics. Soldiers learned the testudo or tortoise formation. They formed a close group with their shields held together in front and overhead. Crouching beneath their protective shell, the soldiers could advance safely as a group. The Roman army excelled at siege tactics, used to capture enemy cities and forts. Siege machines included catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. Catapults were like giant slingshots that fired heavy stones and spears. Heavy battering rams were used to pound walls and gates. Siege towers holding foot soldiers and archers could be rolled up to the enemy's walls. Then a drawbridge was lowered to allow the soldiers onto the walls. The Roman army fought many wars and conquered many lands because of its outstanding organization and tactic skills. So that was the Roman army reading, which goes with these 3 Roman army questions. And there are, again, things highlighted to direct your attention as to where to look for the answers. So, the next set of questions are from the Gladiators reading. There are 3 true or false questions. Number 7, true or false, gladiators were often slaves or prisoners of war. Number 8, true or false, gladiators fought to entertain people. Number 9, true or false, gladiators were trained fighters and even went to gladiator school. So while we're reading, look for those key pieces of information to see whether or not these statements are true or false. Now for the gladiators reading itself, it says, Gladiators, chariots, and the Roman games. 2 men ready their weapons. An excited crowd of Romans cheer loudly in anticipation. Both combatants realize full well that this day might be their last. They are gladiators, men who fight to the death for the enjoyment of others. As the 2 gladiators circle each other, each knows that his objective is to maim or trap his opponent rather than to kill him quickly. What's more, the fight must last long enough to please the crowd. The gladiators jab swords and swing maces. They sweat in the hot sun. Sand and dirt fly. Suddenly, one gladiator traps the other with a net and poises to kill him with a 3-pronged trident. The victor waits for a sign from the crowd. If the losing gladiator has put up a good fight, the crowd might choose to spare his life, and the vanquished gladiator will live to fight another day. But if the crowd is dissatisfied with the losing fighter, as was usually the case, its dissatisfaction meant slaughter. In ancient Rome, death had become a form of entertainment. But the games begin. Before fighting, gladiators had to swear the following oath: I will endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. The Etruscans of northern Italy originally held public games, called ludi, which featured such events as gladiator battles and chariot races as a sacrifice to the gods. The Romans continued the practice, holding games roughly 10 to 12 times in an average year. Paid for by the emperor, the games were used to keep the poor and unemployed entertained and occupied. The emperor hoped to distract the poor from their poverty in the hopes that they would not revolt. Over time, the games became more spectacular and elaborate as emperors felt compelled to outdo the previous year's competitions. The games involved more participants, occurred more frequently, and became more expensive and more outlandish. The Colosseum. In Rome, the gladiatorial contests were held in the Colosseum, a huge stadium that first opened in 80 CE. Located in the middle of the city, the Colosseum was circular in shape with 3 levels of arches around the outside. In height, the Colosseum was as tall as a modern 12-story building, and it held 50,000 spectators. Like many modern professional sports stadiums, the Colosseum had box seats for the wealthy and powerful. The upper level was reserved for the commoners. Under the floor of the Colosseum was a labyrinth of rooms, hallways, and cages where weapons were stored and animals and gladiators waited for their turn to perform. The Colosseum was also watertight and could be flooded to hold naval battles. Special drains allowed water to be pumped in and released, but naval battles were rarely held there because the water caused serious damage to the basic structure of the Colosseum. The gladiators themselves were usually slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war. Occasionally, the gladiators were able to fight for their freedom. Criminals who were sentenced to death were sometimes thrown into the arena unarmed to serve their sentence. Some people, including women, actually volunteered to be gladiators. The Colosseum wasn't the only amphitheater in ancient Rome. There were several scattered throughout the entire empire. The amphitheater pictured above is in Tunisia, Africa. Gladiators were willing to risk death for the possibility of fame and glory. Many gladiators went to special schools that trained them how to fight. A few gladiators boxed, and they used metal gloves to increase cutting and bleeding. Some gladiatorial contests included animals such as bears, rhinos, tigers, elephants, and giraffes. Most often, hungry animals fought other hungry animals, but sometimes hungry animals fought against gladiators in contests called venations, wild beast hunts. On rare occasions, the animals were allowed to maul and eat a live human who was tied to a stake. Bread and circuses. Romans loved chariot races, which were held on special racetracks called circuses. The most famous circus, which was in Rome, was the Circus Maximus. In chariot races, 2 or 4 horse chariots ran 7 laps, totaling anywhere from 3 to 5 miles. Roman games included other types of equestrian events. Some races with horses and riders resembled today's thoroughbred horse racing. In one type of race, riders began the competition on horseback, but later dismounted and ran on foot to the finish. As the Roman Empire started its decline, the author Juvenal noted, "The people are only anxious for 2 things, bread and circuses." And it says, this relief sculpture here from the 2nd century CE illustrates what a chariot race in the Circus Maximus might have looked like. The competitors completed 7 intense laps in front of a crowd of 300,000 people. So that was the gladiator reading, which you'll use that information to answer the true and false questions 7, 8, and 9, which again are gladiators were often slaves or prisoners of war. Gladiators fought to entertain people. Gladiators were trained fighters and even went to gladiator school. So again, if you need to look back in the reading, there's information highlighted and determine whether or not these statements are true or false. The last set of questions are about important people of Rome. And number 10, list the 3 men that made up the first triumvirate. 11, why was Julius Caesar assassinated or stabbed to death? 12, Who did Antony of the Second Triumvirate fall in love with? 13. What name did Octavian become known as? 14. What is the Pax Romana? 15. Why were Nero and Caligula considered bad emperors? So these are the things you want to be listening for or reading for. And we'll be using this reading. Starting with Julius Caesar. By 60 BC, 3 men held the most power in Rome. They were 3 generals: Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. The 3 joined together in the first triumvirate. A triumvirate is a political partnership of 3 people. Caesar's military campaigns. Each member of the triumvirate had a military command. Pompey was in Spain, Crassus was in Syria, Caesar was in Gaul. Caesar became a hero to Rome's lower classes, but the senators thought that he was too popular. When Crassus was killed in 53 BC, they gave Pompey complete control of Rome. 4 years later, they ordered Caesar to give up his army. Caesar knew that if he obeyed the Senate, his rivals might kill him, but if he did not obey, then he was starting a civil war against Rome. Caesar kept his army and marched 5,000 men into Italy. Pompey tried to stop Caesar, but Caesar drove Pompey out of Italy and into Greece. Then in 48 BC, he destroyed Pompey's army completely. After that, the Senate named Caesar dictator of Rome for 1 year. Caesar's rise to power. In 44 BC, Caesar made himself dictator for life. He also filled the Senate with people who supported him. Caesar knew many reforms were needed, so he freed men in Rome's territories, started new colonies so that farmers and soldiers would have land, and forced patricians to hire free workers. Caesar also created the Julian calendar. It had 12 months, 365 days, and a leap year. It was used in Europe until AD 1582, and this is very close to our calendar that we use today. Caesar's supporters thought that he was a strong leader who brought peace to Rome. His enemies thought that he wanted to be king. Caesar was told to beware of the Ides of March 15th, but he did not. On March 15th, 44 BC, his enemies stabbed him to death. They were led by Senator Cassius and Caesar's good friends, Senator Brutus. Rome becomes an empire. After Caesar was killed, another civil war broke out. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus won the civil war. Octavian was Caesar's grandnephew. Antony and Lepidus were Caesar's best generals. In 43 BC, they formed the Second Triumvirate. Soon, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus were fighting with each other. Octavian forced Lepidus to retire. Then Octavian and Antony divided the Roman world. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east. While he was in the east, Antony fell in love with Cleopatra, an Egyptian queen. They made an alliance. Octavian thought that they wanted to take over Rome, so he declared war against them. In 31 BC, they fought the Battle of Actium. Actium is off the west coast of Greece. Octavian crushed Antony and Cleopatra's army and navy. Antony and Cleopatra ran back to Egypt and later killed themselves. Their deaths ended Rome's civil war. The Roman Republic died with them. Octavian was 32 years old when he became the ruler of the Roman world. He decided to build a different kind of government, the Roman Empire. Who was Augustus? Octavian knew that many people wanted to be able to vote for their leaders. Cicero agreed. He was a writer, political leader, and a great speaker. Many people read Cicero's books and heard him speak. They agreed with Cicero's ideas. Cicero supported Octavian. He thought that Octavian would rebuild the Republic. In 27 BC, Octavian said he would, but he did not. Octavian knew that the Republic was too weak to solve Rome's problems, so he gave some power to the Senate, but he kept most of the power himself. Octavian's title was Imperator, which means commander-in-chief. Soon, though, it meant emperor. Octavian also took the title of Augustus. Augustus means that the revered or the majestic one. After that, everyone called him Augustus. The early empire. So before I start reading this part of this reading, you have some key terms at the top. So Pax Romana means Roman peace. Aqueduct is a human-made channel that carries water long distances. And currency is the money system used by a country. Drawing from experience. Have you ever tried to ride your bike on a dirt road or on the grass? It's a lot easier to ride on a sidewalk or a paved road. In the previous section, you learned about Julius Caesar and Augustus and why the Roman Republic ended. In this section, you will learn how Rome's good roads, its water systems, and its common money made the empire rich. So it says Augustus and other Roman empires made many changes, and use the reading to help you list 4 changes and their effects in these boxes. So the Emperor Augustus says, by expanding the empire and reorganizing the military and government, Augustus created a new era of prosperity. There had been fighting in the Mediterranean Sea area for hundreds of years. Augustus, formerly called Octavian, ended the fighting. He took control of the whole area. That brought Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This peace lasted 200 years. What did Augustus achieve? Augustus became emperor in 27 BC. He decided to make the empire strong and safe. He made a professional army of about 150,000 men. All of them were Roman citizens. Augustus also made the Praetorian Guard, which had about 9,000 men. These men were specially picked to guard the emperor. Later, the Praetorian Guard had a lot of political power. Augustus's armies took Spain and Gaul, or France. They also took land where Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria are today. At the same time, Augustus built beautiful buildings in support of the arts, like music, sculpture, and writing. Augustus also bought grain from Africa for the poor. He knew that well-fed people do not rebel as much as hungry people. At that time, more than 50 million people lived in the Roman Empire. The empire was divided into provinces. Augustus appointed a proconsul, or governor, for each province. He changed the tax laws. By making tax collectors government workers, he stopped them from taking some of the taxes for themselves. He also made a set of laws for free men who were not citizens. This meant that Roman laws protected everyone. Many of these free men later became citizens. Who came after Augustus? Augustus ruled for almost 40 years. He died in AD 14. A relative named Tiberius had been trained to follow him. The next 3 emperors, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, were also relatives. They are called the Julio-Claudian emperors. Not all of them were good rulers. Tiberius and Claudius ruled well, but Caligula and Nero were very cruel. Caligula was also mentally ill. He had people killed, wasted a lot of money, and even made his horse a consul. Finally, the Praetorian Guard killed him and made Claudius emperor. Nero was also cruel. He killed many people, including his mother and 2 wives. He finally killed himself. Legend says that Nero played his violin when the city of Rome burned in AD 64. Unity and prosperity. Rome's systems of roads, aqueducts, ports, and common currency made the empire rich and prosperous. A general named Vespasian restored peace. He also began building the Colosseum, a huge amphitheater in the middle of Rome. Vespasian also stopped several rebellions. In addition, in AD 70, his son Titus's army defeated the Jews. The Romans destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. After he died, his son Titus ruled. Two disasters struck when Titus ruled. First, the volcano Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the city of Pompeii. Second, a large fire burned Rome. After Titus, Vespasian's other son, Domitian, ruled. Both of his sons helped Rome to grow. The Good Emperors. From AD 96 to AD 180, a series of good emperors came to power. They were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. During their rule, trade grew and people had a better life than before. The 5 good emperors ruled wisely. Trajan gave money to the poor. Hadrian made the laws easier to understand. Antoninus Pius passed laws to help orphans. All 5 hired thousands of people to build roads, bridges, monuments, harbors, and aqueducts. An aqueduct is a human-made channel that carries water for long distances. The good emperors conquered new territory for Rome. The empire was biggest when Trajan ruled. It spread from the Mediterranean to Britain and Mesopotamia. But the empire was too big to rule well. Hadrian pulled troops out of Mesopotamia. In Europe, Hadrian pulled back too. He sent the empire's boundaries at the Rhine and at the Danube rivers. Hadrian also built Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to stop the Picts and Scots from attacking. The Picts and Scots were warrior tribes in Britain. In the AD 100s, the Roman Empire was one of the greatest empires in history. It had 3.5 million square miles of land, and most people spoke Latin or Greek. The empire held together because people thought of themselves as Romans. Even if they spoke different languages, they had the same laws and rulers. They had many of the same customs too. Soldiers and government workers carried Roman culture with them, and people learned it. In addition, the Romans gave many people the rights of being a citizen. In AD 212, every free man was made a Roman citizen. A booming economy. Agriculture was the most important part of the empire's economy. Farmers in Italy, Gaul or France, and Spain grew grapes and olives. Making wine and olive oil became big business. Farmers in Britain and Egypt grew grains. There was industry with potters, weavers, and jewelers. Some cities became centers for making glass, bronze, and brass. Traders came from all over the world to ports in Italy. They brought silk from China, spices from India, tin from Britain, lead from Spain, and iron from Gaul. Roads and money. The Roman Empire had a good transportation system. This helped grow trade. During the Pax Romana, the empire had 50,000 miles of roads. The Roman Navy kept pirates off the Mediterranean Sea. This meant that merchant ships were safer. By 100 AD, everyone in the empire used a common currency or money. This made it easy to trade. It meant that a merchant in Greece could sell to a person in Italy or Egypt. The Romans also made a system of weights and measures. People knew how much they were selling and buying, and this made trade easier too. Ongoing inequality. Shopkeepers and merchants lived well during this time. So did skilled workers who made things. Rich Romans made their fortunes bigger. They lived in luxury. However, most people in the cities and on the farms were still poor, and many other people were still enslaved. So I know that was a lot of information, but this reading here that's titled Julius Caesar Augustus emperors. This is what you'll use for these last questions, 10 through 15. And remember, Miss Solano does highlight information for you guys to help make it a little bit more clear where you should be looking for these answers. Again, I'm going to do my best to try and put timestamps, as I know that this is going to be a really long video and not everybody wants to watch this all at once or have to kind of scramble to find what section they really want to be looking at the time. So please be on the lookout for that. That should be hopefully in the description box of this YouTube video.